mention a couple things coming up as part of our lecture series. We have a bonus lecture on October 5th. It will be Thursday, October 5th. Professor Ken Brown will be here. Probably many of you have seen Ken Brown speak before, but he's an amazing, has an amazing body of knowledge, and he'll be talking about what Japanese painting tells us about gardens, and from a historical perspective, you can see from paintings what was happening in gardens and how gardens may have looked, or so that should be really interesting. And then in our normal October time slot, the third Thursday, Beauty in Bronze, Carl Millis in America. So the director of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research will be here. Do any of you know of Cranbrook? Cranbrook is a prep school in outside of Detroit. So it's an amazing campus, incredible architecture, and one of the biggest collections of Carl Millis sculpture in the world. And so Greg Whitcop will be here from Cranbrook, and it should be really interesting to find out more about Millis the man and the art. And of course, we have 3 Carl Millis bronzes out in the garden, the 3 angels. But tonight's lecture, Mr. John Powell, you've read his bio, you know that he's trained extensively in Japan. He's been improving Japanese gardens and building Japanese gardens all over the country. We talked about him a little bit, that John Powell's footprint is getting pretty significant in North American Japanese gardens. All over the place, the upper Midwest, a bunch in Minnesota, some around the Great Lakes, the East Coast, Texas, Arkansas, the Japanese Friendship Garden in Phoenix, and now another garden in Maryland and one in Baltimore. So he is all over the place. He's also been working with Japan House at the University of Illinois, and many of you know of our connection with Japan House and Professor Kimiko Gunji and all the things that go on there. But John's been working with their staff to improve that garden. And then there'll be an annex to Japan House, which John is going to do the garden design and implementation of that design in the next couple years, perhaps.
Hopefully next year.
That'd be great.
Start.
So besides all that, amazing knowledge of Japanese gardens and Japanese culture, but also has incredible knowledge of music, among other things, and was a world champion caliber disc golf player right here. So he's a great gardener and a longtime great friend. Please welcome John Powell.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm always excited to come here and honored to speak to all of you here, and so hopefully what happened. It's resting. All right, it's gonna come here in a minute. So tonight I am going to speak about elegant beauty, or Kirei Sabi, or probably more properly daimyo-cha, and its effect on Japanese gardens. So as soon as we get this right here, and we'll begin. I'm going to try and speak as quickly as Ken Brown does, but I don't know if I can. I'm going to try and go through all of these things. There's a lot of information here. I tried to break it down so that you could maybe fill in the gaps of your understanding, and hopefully at the end we'll have some time for some questions. So much of the research that I did for this came from a few pretty influential books. Mark Keene's book on the Japanese tea garden was one. Vivek Heiterk, who was one of my professors years ago, his book, Themes in the History of Japanese Garden Art, is fantastic. Lorraine Cook's book from 1935, The World of Japanese Gardens, is really influential, partly because one of her neighbors was Shigemori Mide. who was a great garden historian and garden builder as well. And then I used Shigemoto's son book, Kanto's book, Japanese Gardens, Island of Serenity, for the bulk of this, and then a lot of it was just sort of information that I had lying around. So while we use this term Kirei Sabi today, likely in the 1500s they called it daimyo-cha. And this term Kirei Sabi really came post-war when we were really starting to study Japanese gardens, more almost like probably the 15th Japanese garden renaissance in the world. But after World War II, there was quite a renaissance and study of some of the old. So while I've used Kirei Sabi or elegant beauty as the definition or translation of Kirei Sabi, there are other translations that we could use, like graceful simplicity or even worn elegance. So before we go too much into Kirei Sabi though, I want to talk a little bit about Wabi Sabi, which preceded Kirei Sabi and is this idea of the beauty of imperfection in its sort of place both within the garden and within Japanese cultural arts. So the formalizer of this movement, Wabi Sabi, Sen Rikyu, lived from 1522 to 1591. This movement evolved mainly amongst town people and the merchant class towards the end of the 1400s, where Japan was sort of coming out of some really terrible civil wars, the Onin Wars, if you're familiar with that. It basically completely destroyed Kyoto at the time. And after that, there was a time of some relative peace. And so some things like this, started to happen. Since Wabi Sabi is integrally tied to Chado or the way of tea, we kind of need to understand a quick sort of evolution of tea. So tea first is brought to Japan from China, although it originated likely in other places in the world, but through China with the word of Buddhism, basically. And so Buddhist priests use it as an aid to meditation, as medicine, all of these things. Then Japan starts to cultivate tea, and as tea consumption spread throughout Japan, the next big era was the sort of during the Kamakura period, this period maybe between 11 and about 1400, late 1300s, where there were these really sort of lavish tea parties where they were, sampling Chinese teas and trying to decide which tea it was and all of these different things. Then after this period comes these merchant sort of tea masters and their wabi-sabi aesthetics. And then soon after that, beginning of the 1600s, really late 1500s, we begin to see the sort of the emergence of Kirei Sabi, or really daimyo-cha, a tea that was geared towards these basically military class of Japan, of daimyo, magistrates, of like mayors of different towns. And it's really important to understand that now we're not fighting each other in civil war. We're basically sort of tied to one leader, the shogun, and you have to pay your sort of respects to that. But the unification of the country was a huge part in making this all possible. Otherwise, I don't know that we would have gotten to this. At this time, architecturally, we started to see a shift in from the older Shoin style, which was still a kind of a palatial construction. Shoin actually means like study. It had a small sort of alcove desk study that they like to put into a slightly more rustic style. And so rather than this lavish tea room, we would create sort of a rustic hermitage to prepare and enjoy the tea. So this new kind of tea house was called a soan. This new rustic tea was definitely infused with Zen thought, although none of these guys were particularly noted for, being big proselytizers of Buddhism, yet they used the thought. And certainly the emotions of wabi-sabi, like yugen, this sort of subtle or mysterious profundity, and sabishi, loneliness and desolation, became really common and preferred themes. I mean, I think they had just come out of some terrible wars and just wanted to chill, I guess, in modern terminology. Rikyu, though, was very spiritually minded and renowned for his ability to find beauty in nature and then refine that natural beauty, which is really, I think, at the core of certainly wabi aesthetics. If I go back to that picture, this is, of course we have none of Rikyu's tea houses left today, but this is purported to be kind of Rikyu's idea of the Soan, of that rustic hermitage. He put together much of what we know of the tea room today. He liked it pretty dark, pretty closed in, and pretty small, so that you were really focused on the bowl of tea and nothing else. But one great thing that came out of this time was the roji. And the roji is what we call the garden that surrounds a tea house. So Rikyu and his teachers were developing all this in Sakai, not in Kyoto, not in Eto, not in Tokyo, but in Sakai, which was a seaport on the inland sea, actually. Very populous place. And so these guys were retired, and the first tea houses and tea gardens were very inauspicious. Nothing like what we see today, these sort of verdant oases. Roji has a lot of different names or ways it can be written and translated, including alleyway, often a narrow path. Dewy ground is one that we hear a lot, but there are several. This sort of wabi-cha really was all about a narrow sort of inward focus, this beeline that you would take.
What year are you referring to now?
We're probably in 1570s, a while ago. Actually, for Rikyu, his gardens, the earliest sort of writing we have about any of this, it was called Subo no Uchi, which was really just more of a reference to a size and space, and all it really was an arrangement of stones and a basin in close proximity to the tea house. There were no plantings of any kind. But when they were planted, Rikyu really liked evergreens. He favored pines, firs, and cleara, which, you have clearas here? What is it called? Mokoku in Japan, which is it's like a glossy broadleaf evergreen. He liked them planted really thick, like dark woods. He thought this really heightened the mood. Sakai is on the ocean, on the sea, and there's stories of his tea house, one of his tea houses, where he had a beautiful view of the sea. He planted it so thickly you couldn't see it. One little glimpse, maybe on the way in. So, as time went on, this wabi-cha really grew, and the military class hooked onto it. Plus, they were fighting each other a little bit less, so they had a little bit more time to get into it. So, Rikyu had numerous students during this time, but 7 of these disciples figure really prominently in the growth of tea and tea gardens at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th. These 7 disciples, or Shichitetsu, it's a name in Japanese, tend to vary a little bit depending upon which tea school you're in. But there are 7, or the Magnificent 7, as I like to call them. Oh, no, not these guys. Oh no, not this is the 7 samurai, not not them either, but these guys. So these guys are all from military class, but very sort of interesting group of people. There's this Gamo Ujisato in the upper left. This guy, Takayama Ukon, was a Christian daimyo that in the end actually gave up his entire fiefdom instead of apostatized. And then he was kicked out of the country. This guy is pretty important, Hosokawa Sansai. Many think that he's sort of the originator of this daimyo-cho. These two guys here are both military commanders, Shibayama and Seita. And this guy, Makimura, he was also believed to be a Christian daimyo. They think actually of 7 of these disciples, about 5 of them were devout Christians, including Rikyu's wife. But the main guy was this guy, Furuta Oribe. So Oribe lived from about 1544 to 1614. He was so famous, he even got his own manga books, albeit 400 years after his death, but it's really, Kyogemon is really, it's a fun read, even if you can't read Japanese. So Oribe had a higher, placed a higher value on aesthetics, form over function, where Rikyu was 60% function, 40% form. This guy was 60 aesthetics and 40 function. He liked a much brighter tea room. He also introduced a lot of different tea wares, a lot of which were thought to be rough and unbalanced and often abstract. Like the picture I showed in the very beginning, that's actually the 16th generation Raku potter Kitazaimon's recent work. Very much like Oribe Yaki or Oribe ware. Oribe's tea house became much more spacious and brighter, but still sort of followed Rikyu's goal. Oribe is also credited with developing the 2-part roji, the inner and the outer roji, the way we sort of have the garden today, and a much wider variety of plants, including more deciduous trees and a greater use of conifers. He had much more dynamic paving for Rikyu. Again, it was all business just to get from A to B. He used a greater variety of shapes of paving stones, stepping stones essentially, where Rikyu would favor a 2-inch reveal on a stepping stone from ground to the top of the stone. Oribe liked it a little bit lower, closer to 1.5 inches. He liked to see his stepping stones placed the width of a sensu, of a Japanese fan, in between them. So really, for a gardener, this is like such vital information, because it's interesting, as time went on, stepping stones got larger, the space then reduced because of the size of the stone, but pretty neat thing. He was fine with a mix of colors, sometimes a brocade of colors of stepping stones. He used cut stones, kind of maybe one of the first to probably introduce cut stone pieces, including tanzaku, the rectangular stones that we see so frequently in gardens today. The only real caution he had about paving was just like, don't use 2 stones of the same shape, size and shape, right next to each other. Other than that, he was pretty loose, a lot looser. You know, I should say, while I'm tagging a few guys as the leaders of this movement, there were hundreds and thousands of gardeners and carpenters and lacquerware people and metal workers and loggers and other crafts that were actually doing this work. There were just a couple of these sort of visionary Renaissance men, if you will, that started this. He developed a new style of lantern called the ikekomi, which means to bury, basically. But it allowed to adjust the height of what we call the light box by burying the pedestal to different heights so that you could project light onto the basin in different ways. He actually, most likely, developed this style of garden or lantern called the oribe. There's also a picture on the wall over here of an oribe. I could do an hour just on oribe lanterns, their significance within tea gardens, within Japanese gardens, within Christianity. It's a really long story. Oribe is also credited with creating a more developed sukubai arrangement. We actually call this one piece a chosubachi, just the basin. But in Rikyu's time, all you had was the maiishi, the front stone, and the basin. Oribe is credited with sort of improving that and adding stones for candle and for hot water. And so depending upon which tea school you're in, the elevation of these stones varies. I wanted to make one mention. I didn't do a whole lot with bamboo fences in this, but bamboo fences have been in Japanese gardens in Japan since well over 1,000 years. In the Heian Nara periods, they were being used for enclosure, basically. They really sort of picked up in the Kamakura period, which is going to be a couple hundred years before this. But in the development of the two-part roji, this separation type fence, this transparent fence called the four-eyed fence or yotsumegaki, and these wicker type gates became a transitional space, further preparing the guests to get into the tea room. We need to do a thing on bamboo fences, the history of bamboo fences. So like that one, Koetsuji, that's a temple in Kyoto that one's famed for, but there was some craftsmen out there that figured out how to do that. He's also credited with the use and creation of the koshikake machiai, the covered waiting bench that would be put usually in the outer roji, where the guests would sometimes prepare themselves. Back in the day, they'd have a smoke there and they would wait for a signal from the tea master to move through the chumon, that middle gate, closer towards the tea room. He also preferred a more open roji, connecting it to other landscapes within the garden or natural landscapes. Where Rikyu liked those trees planted really thickly, Oribe favored the same trees, I think, planted thickly, but he would limb them up so it would be easier to clean the garden. So maybe he was as practical as Rikyu. He planted in clumps instead of rows. Very difficult in a long, narrow space not to plant things in a row. So this idea of planting in clumps is definitely a challenge for a garden builder. He didn't like flowering plants in the roji. It's not that we don't have them, but there are challenges because of the way it relates to the tokonoma, the alcove that displays the flowers, the scroll, etc. He certainly would never use a flowering tree was okay, unless it was like a magnolia or something with this giant blend. But if the tree's flowers were to be used in the tokonoma for tea flowers, and then that tree would go on to bear fruit, you couldn't plant it. This is a lot to remember as a garden builder. He didn't like kumasasa. Kumasasa is a type of bamboo ground cover with really big leaves because it was really messy and they're hard to clean up. But he liked regular sasa, the small ones. Whereas Rikyu loved it because he thought it looked like bamboo mats when the leaves were laying down on the ground. So Oribe just kind of continued the refinement of all of these things and elements within both the tea room, but on the outside. He came up with what we call the Gakumi Ishi, the stone where you go to read the plaque on the tea house. You have this?
It's not particularly evident.
Okay, it's not always have, but so this was one thing I was going to do, is try and like show all of these things within Anderson Gardens, but then I said, nah, that's your homework. There's also what we call the Gakumi Matsu, would be a pine that would frame both usually the sort of the ridge of the tea house and the sign. He came up with the Seikimori Ishi, the stone with the rope on it that sort of blocks access to an area. Seiki Chiku, these are bamboo fences that block access. I like the one in the back of the guest house. Looks like a keikai. Keikai is another way of saying seiki. He defined more terms. There's a tree, and this you definitely have a lot of. We call the sore suri no rui. That's like a tree where the sleeve of your kimono brushes on it. And so it had always been sort of there, but he really sort of made the point to garden builders and designers, said, don't plant this tree. Just make your path in your garden go past that tree. Uchimizu, which is, it's actually getting some love lately about people, just cleaning the streets, but it's always been around since Rikyu's time to wet the garden as an act of purification. He upped it in between for a formal tea. It was before the guests arrived. It would be in between thin and thick tea. It would be after thick tea, before the last thin tea. So all of these things are Rikyu. Quick side note on the Roji at this point, no mention of moss until 1630. However, there were mentions of moss in cultivated as a ground cover as early as, I don't know, probably 11th century or something like that. But the only sort of mentions in the early days were that, if it's growing on a lantern or on a basin, as long as it's not on the cleaning part, if it's just on the side or on the edge, it's okay. But there is mention of other things. Pine needles was one way. Rikyu often would pound large cobblestones into the mud next to the stepping stones. So grass was mentioned as frequently, if not more than moss at the time. Another thing that Rikyu liked and became really popular going forward was a technique called Sakiagari, where we sort of plant the smaller plants in front and the taller ones in back. And while he was totally a tea guy and known for his tea gardens, there's a Seikimori Ishi. He is credited with this temple, Nanshuji, where you can really get a feeling of the Sakiagari technique. This is the viewing area at the temple, and the materials being layered up farther than that. So like Rikyu, Oribe had tons of students, but certainly his best student and most known was this guy, Kobori Enshu, who was born in 1579. There is some writing that he met Rikyu, but he would have only been 8 or 9 years old. This guy was born into wealth. His father was a daimyo. He was in the right place at the right time. He lived in Fushimi, the river port south of Kyoto. Hideyoshi, who was then the Ganpaku, he wasn't the shogun, but he was the military regent, was building his castle there. And he, at a very quick rate, became a magistrate, and then later what they called the Sakuji Bugyo, he's like the important person that was in charge of all architecture and construction for this new shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate. So with all the work that he had to do, all of these projects, there's no way he did all these things. But he had some people, and as we get to the end, I'll explain a little bit about some of those people that, as just part of Japanese history, were sort of the unmentionables. We're digging up some information on them, but there was very little written information about them at the time. He was, though, super creative, not just with gardens. He was good in everything. Ikebana. He still has his own tea school. He has his own flower school. He was a great calligrapher, even a really good cook. So he was totally a Renaissance guy. So during his time, they called that enshu gonomi. Even if he didn't do it, gonomi means like taste. It was his taste, and it was very pervasive into, it was the thing. Enshu, though, really liked an even balance of form and function. So he was probably the 50-50 guy. And whereas Oribe was like into flamboyant artistry, this guy Enshu was marked more by conservative traditionalism. So it's good. Could be good for what's about to happen. So during this time, tea rooms basically begin to grow larger. So this is one that's been moved about 10 times probably. That was one of Enshu's. So not just do we have the tea room now, we have extra rooms. We might have a gathering room. We might have a larger musea, kitchen area. Sometimes the toilet is actually moved to the inside. So the whole thing is expanding a little bit. He's also sort of transferring back over to the Shoin style. This is Yosuite. This is actually one that is still around, and this one always reminds me of the one here with the arch bridge on the way to the tea house. Yosuite was very famous for not so much its exterior architecture, but for windows. This is what they call the tea room of 13 windows. So this is a complete departure from Rikyu, where it's very dark and sort of closed in, to this, all these different, Renji model, Shitaji model, all these different styles of windows are now appearing into the tea room itself. So we're starting to transfer back from this sort of Soan rustic hermitage to the Shoin style with the incorporation of the writing desk. This reminds me of the guest house, where we have a large tokonoma. Then we also have a side tokonoma, or a side alcove. So this would have been an area you would, he's letting more light in, one, but you could also sit there and write. Another example of it where there's now some storage down below. This is often the way we see tea rooms today. Tea rooms aren't typically 4.5 mats or smaller. We're 8 mats, 6 mats, 8 mats, 10 mats and larger, and we're often seeing this type of layout. During Enshu's time, there was definitely an increase in the use of sabi type materials. So this sabi really means rust, but this sort of refined and this beauty, this patina that's created in these aged pieces. We're also seeing a lot more recycled materials. Rikyu probably started this idea of mitate, bringing something from somewhere else into a new function. More here. The yoseidoro is a type of stone lantern that was like made of other stone lanterns. We'd never seen this before, but it became really popular. The idea of using borrowed scenery within even a tea garden became much more popular. And while this wasn't done by Enshu knew this was happening. This is Katsura Rikyu, detached villa, imperial villa. There are writings of him going there and talking about it, but he would have been way too busy. This tea house, though, is a really fantastic example of this new sort of daimyo-cha, this new sort of tea experience that embodied, a much more grand space of enjoyment. Just another shot of this one called Shokinte. I wasn't sure if those were even going to come out very well. So the interior of the main room, much more dynamic. He really focused on details and contrast. Lots of nice Sabi materials inside of the tea room. This is the smaller, more traditional tea room to the main room. He expanded, or at least, you know, there are other examples of this in other gardens, but at Shokinte, I love this picture because this is probably 100 years ago or so. You can see this large stone right here, one here, and you can see a stepping stone here. This is actually the Sukubai arrangement, the crouching place, the place of ritual purification before going to the tea room, was to go and rinse your hands and your mouth and wipe away the outside world before you went to the tea room. So the old motif was just to have the basin with the lantern, you put your bucket and your light down. Here, you could either go to this stone or actually go down to the pond, which is part of the Katsura River, and make the purification happen there. You've never done that before. And here's a more modern picture of that arrangement, so that when the guest would come to this, stand on the front stone, go to use the basin, the whole of the garden and the pond was enlarged out of the surface of the water right here. So pretty subtle, but pretty huge change. He really expanded the use of this idea of shin-gyo-so, which is formal to informal, and in between the mixing of materials of very symmetrical shapes with very natural forms. It's really the first time that we would have seen in the natural pond. This is much more Western or European style to use cut stone edging on a pond. That's Shokinte behind it, the same tea house. The idea of creating scenery or repeating natural scenery started to come into gardens more. Katsura Rikyu is really famous for its sort of replication of a famous place in Japan called Amano Hashirate, the bridge to heaven, basically. That is they're having a big rock concert out there coming up. It's one of like the 3 most beautiful natural places in Japan, but this is the first time we would really see these begin to be created in gardens. While this was not Enshu either, this garden was built about the same time in Kyushu with this replica of Mount Fuji in the background. This is the tea house right here. Then I threw in this shot of the Taj Mahal to just talk a little bit about terminal vistas and bilateral symmetry. Enshu had contact with the Portuguese before they were ultimately kicked out, but then the Dutch that were in Japan during the rest of Enshu's life. And he learned about some Western landscape design, even though this is an Eastern design, but he learned about formal landscape construction a little bit, and then sort of used it. Terminal vista, you never see in a Japanese garden. He used it quite often at some of the temples in Kyoto in a much subtler fashion, but this also is the Katsura Rikyu with the formal hedge with the pine as a terminal vista. Just earth-shattering ideas. Then he was also a big proponent of clipped shrubbery. This was sort of new for gardens, not just beyond hedges. This is what we call Okarikomi, or the pruned wave. Now this is a story of a wave, actually, but it's thought that when it was originally done at this garden, these were kanji characters. And so again, a sort of a revolutionary technique that is over. It's in every garden right now. So now so that's kind of the movement from Wabi Sabi to Kirei Sabi, Daimyo Cha, but at the same time, some other garden things were happening, and I just wanted to go through them so you can see how these things morphed over into other styles of gardens. Now, it's hard to find any quintessential one style of garden. So a gardener in Japan, there's basically 5 styles of garden. There's the pleasure boating style, there's hill and pond, there's dry landscape, there's tea gardens, and there are stroll gardens. Go.
Can I go back to the tea houses? Sukiya style tea house, how does that fit in with these tea houses?
So they will all then, it's the same. So Soan is Sukiya Zukuri, Sukiya architecture. They just called it a Soan, which means like hut.
Oh, okay.
Whereas before,
So this is the evolution of the
yeah,
Sukiya style.
before it was much more formal sort of architecture, Shoin style. It started in a Shinden style, which is sort of a replication of the Chinese model of palace construction, morphed into Shoin style to better fit the Japanese landscape, and then to Sukiya Zukuri, and then sort of shifted back a little bit. It's very confusing.
Thank you.
It's hard to keep up with. Historically, though, gardens in Japan started first with the palace gardens in the about 600, then temple gardens. These were mostly pond and island and very sort of scenic gardens, followed by medieval gardens. This is the Kamakura period. This pond and island sort of morphed into the smaller hill and pond that was more just, they were smaller, basically. And then Kare Sansui. This term actually didn't appear until 1850. Prior to that time, we just called them flat gardens. Then tea gardens, that's kind of where we are now, and stroll gardens. Really, all of the things that were happening in the tea garden in the period from Rikyu through Enshu were a miniaturized version of the stroll gardens that we know today. So one of Enshu's first jobs when he comes to Kyoto is the renovation of this garden. This is Niigata Castle. There's no way one guy could do this, not even 100 guys. And we really think Lorraine Cook made the point that this came from what they called the Fushimi school. These were guys that built the castle for Hideyoshi in Fushimi. When that was done, they came up and they built this project here. It takes some really high-skilled guys in 1610 to build a garden like this.
1610, that was my question, but the second part of the question is, which of those garden history styles would this garden be?
Hill and pond. So now we're in a situation, so Niigata Castle is here, and this is what we're looking at. So if I'm gonna have a meeting with my military commanders, we're gonna open all the doors maybe at the end of the meeting. This is what we're gonna look at. So it wasn't really so much to enter into this garden and walk around as it was to have this sort of scenic garden. But this style of rock arrangement was beginning to be the popular thing, especially this era would have been the end of the Momoyama period and right at the beginning of the Tokugawa era. This garden is not built by Enshu, but built by the same guys that built Niigata Castle. This is Sanboin. This was Hideyoshi's castle after it was destroyed in Fushimi. This is the story of the Fujiro stone, the famous sort of stone that possessed these wonderful powers. It was so big they couldn't move it, so they broke it into pieces and reassembled it inside this garden. But I really show this just to show you that this was a process. People were learning how to build these gardens and building them at a quick rate. Enshu did build this garden. This is Sento Gosho. This was built for a retired emperor. And basically, the writings of the time were that there was this new sort of romantic countryside romantic sort of going on in building these gardens. And there are writings of, you know, Enshu's work to do the stonework on this island. But the theme essentially took really big properties and applied the tea garden, the roji sort of aesthetic to them. This garden's quite interesting because it has this giant suhama, this rock beach that goes around it. Enshu didn't do that. That wasn't put in until the 1800s. But that was one of the first big strolling type gardens he built. The next one was Shugakuin, also a retired emperor's location outside of Kyoto, and the same effect is happening. I mean, they're sort of going back to the older pond and island style garden, but there was defined paths throughout these, and that was part of the experience. And so, as you move through these gardens, you would begin to see all of these different details. This guy was super busy. This is Konshin. This is like the only one that's even remotely symmetrical. This was built after Ieyasu died, and it was to honor and pray for felicity for his move to Satori, to enlightenment. But it's the theme of the crane on the one side and the turtle on the other side. A recurring theme in Enshu's gardens, in a lot of gardens at the time. It has a massive viewing stone, and then something that had never been done before was the spreading of the Black River stones to evoke the feeling of water rather than just using gravel. He also did Raikuji. Raikuji again uses the crane and slightly up the hill, the tortoise theme. And when you're actually in this building and you look at it, it looks like a dry waterfall or dry stream coming down the mountain. But the big change here was all of the clipped shrubbery. That image I showed you before of the azaleas that were really severely cut would be on the left side of the picture. Borrowed scenery, of course, is, you know, that's the great gift of Japan, is to be able to build gardens like that. He also built Shodenji. This garden has no stones, has gravel, and clipped azaleas, and Mount Hei in the background, which is pretty awesome. This garden actually was destroyed numerous times, and this is one of the gardens that Shigemori Mirei restored in the 1930s. This is, where is this? This is Ryotanji. This is in Hamamatsu, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere. But this style of viewing garden, was definitely a favored sort of military class garden, because they could experience the whole thing from the inside. But you can see the whole idea of Sakiagari, where the plantings are going up the hill.
This is about 1650 or so?
Yep. All happening at the same time. There are some writings that, you know, they had to wait on some gardens because this one guy named Kente, Ken in this case means clever, and Te means garden, so like clever gardener. It also means like clever little brother, which is kind of a poke, but anyway. Kente, they had to wait for Kente to finish one job and get to the other job. And when I see that, I think it's like this friend of mine, Shigeru Namba, and Ron Herman, who's passed away. But you know, Namba-san was Ron Herman's Kente. He did all the work. Ron just took credit. Nanzenji. This garden slightly reminds me of the dry garden that's out here. The seashore type style. He he was not particularly a Buddhist thinker, but he often used the Buddhist, motifs within the gardens. This is Manshuin. This is just a little temple by Shugakuen, that big stroll garden I showed you before. This is just really similar to the dry garden at Portland. That's what Grace put there. And then I think this might be the last picture I have. This is Bozen at Kohan. This was going to be where he retired. This composition, this is actually a Yosei Dodo. These are like pieces of different lanterns put together. This type of basin, really close to the veranda like this, the spreading of the black stones, the low hedge right there. What we don't see in the background is Lake Biwa, is a giant lake basically to the north, I guess, of Kyoto. And this design like sort of embodies the Inshugonomi, this idea of all of the senses sort of working together to create a space. He could sit here, and when he looked out, he could see Lake Biwa and see the fishing boats out there. And at a certain time of day in the afternoon, it just created those emotional feelings that he had worked so hard for all his life. Unfortunately, he died before it was finished. So I don't know what that really means in the whole story, but all of these things had such a mark on Japanese gardens. I mean, we're still doing these things today. So now I think when you look at gardens, you'll be like, oh, that came from there. And now we really can't define any of them as being sort of their own thing. There's pieces of everything in each one. We have here a stroll garden and a dry landscape garden and a tea garden. We have all of these things sort of put together. And in many ways, this was happening at the same time here. And thankfully, a lot of these examples are still out there the way we saw them today. And I think there's one story I'll end with that I thought about because it was raining tonight when I looked at the dry garden and I could see the water on the trees. He told a story that when the first time I think he may have served tea here, he was going to prepare the flowers for the tokonoma. And he went outside and it had just rained and the water was hanging on the leaves of the trees, and he just he couldn't do anything. So he just went in and he just splashed some water on the wall in the tokonoma. And then when his friends asked him about it later, he said, I tried to, but I couldn't make it any more beautiful than it was on the leaves of the tree. So I just thought I would put some water on the wall. Okay, I think that's all I have. Questions? There got to be a question. That's about 400 years of garden right there.
So when he was changing the style of the garden, was he also changing anything in the tea ceremony itself?
Yeah, so he has his own school of tea. And so yeah, that was sort of happening. What was really happening? It was there was again, with the relative peace, there was more time to do things like this. So there were often daimyos that had ideas about gardens, and then they would consult with a professional like this. And then it became this idea of balancing site, client, materials. That was all new. That really wasn't a thing before this. As far as tea goes, yeah, there were definitely some changes. That really kind of ramped up a little bit after his death around 1650, especially once You know, the whole tea thing is crazy. Rikyu had to commit seppuku because he irritated the Ganpaku. Oribe had to commit seppuku. His son had to commit seppuku because they got on the wrong side of a military coup and didn't support the Tokugawa shogunate. This guy was pretty lucky and just sort of rolled with the whole thing. But after that happened, after the name of Rikyu, of Sen actually, was restored, then the grandsons were allowed back in, and that's when we really see the definition of like Ura Senke, Amote Senke, Murokoji Senke. All of those schools of tea begin to happen, and so Enshu would have been a spur off of that. So yeah, each guy is going to have a little bit of change, you know. So you could imagine if you have a really strict teacher and you learn really well, you might not do it so tough. And they thought that Rikyu was really stiff. You know, that Hosokawa Sansai was especially one of those that thought, you know, we should be enjoying this. You know, when you come to the tea room, it should be a pleasurable experience. But it morphed from, you know, this idea of just gathering in a sort of a solemn sort of meditation over a bowl of tea into almost a required political business practice to gather, and you know, you're going to have a bowl of tea before you talked about, you know, the next road or whatever you were going to do.
I'm just curious that, like, in all my times, all the lectures I've seen and so forth, there's not a lot of information, like, after Enshu, up until Ogawa in the early part of the 20th century. Is that a lost history? Or
No, I mean, it's just not as looked at. So Vivek Kaitor has a really good book about that, from basically 1650 to 1950 to the modern era. And so what was happening was there's always, depending upon how, you know, socioeconomic things are going, there's a period of nostalgia. So the Heian Garden became popular again, like the writings in Sakuteki of, you know, lots of grasses and perennials. That became sort of popular again for a little bit. So yeah, that's the place to go and look if you want to see where that's at. But essentially, it's still being done like this. You know, one of the biggest changes was maybe not Ogawa Jihei, because he was sort of just copying the same model as everybody else, but Juki Ida. And Ida was the one, you know, that basically created Zoki no Niwa, this idea, the Anderson Garden theme. I mean, yeah, Kurisa-san can trace his roots back to Juki Ida as well. So it's out there. I mean, it just is sort of a up and down, but I think it's driven more by money than anything else. I mean, this was just like the golden age. I mean, just some of those gardens there, those are the best in Japan.
So, mentioning the name Juki Ida, just so everyone here knows, so the designer of this garden, Hoichi Kurisu's teacher was Ogata Kenzo, and Juki Ida was Ogata Kenzo's one of his teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So it's an interesting lineage we're a part of.
It is, and you know, we don't see a whole lot of true innovations within the garden. I mean, the tea garden was a massive innovation. The stroll garden, lesser, but still a pretty incredible innovation. But really not until, I don't know, maybe Zoki no Niwa did we really have any sort of, and that even then, all it did was really change the flesh and not the bones. I mean, essentially the construct's the same as it's been for centuries, but the planting scheme and the mood, I guess, as a result, are affected by the composition of the, you know, of the clothes that you wear. So
That Zoki no Niwa was like a Juki Ida construct.
Yeah,
with
he-
scattered or miscellaneous trees.
Yes, he worked with Ogawa Ji, and some other great ones came out. Katsuo Saito actually was with that at the end of that too. And yeah, he just saw like there was a lot happening. I mean, the West had just come to Japan, so they were changing everything. It's like Western clothes, people started sitting in chairs, and a lot of, you know, romantic writings about Japan were like, you know, the old Japan will never be back. It never will. I mean, I don't think any of us could see it, you know, because, I mean, you can see little glimpses of it, but boy, probably prior to about 1850, it would have been a totally different world. So, yeah, it's an interesting kind of turn of events, but I think Juki Ito was responding to the idea that, you know, these old traditional gardens are too hard to care for. Well, honestly, I think it's harder. You got more work here than a traditional garden in many ways, just because of the amount of possible changes, withering, and I mean that's one thing that, you know, Enshu sort of said about the clipped shrubbery using the okarikomi garden. Once you've like created the shape like at Shorenji with the, you can pretty much maintain that for 500 years. But the other gardens, tea gardens, it's always a ebb and flow. There's plants are withering, there's tornadoes. I mean, not tornadoes, but there was a tornado here. He had a tornado at his garden. So that was kind of like his, you know, this is how we can basically create a design and maintain the design for a long period of time. Look at Ryoanji, I mean, the 15 stone garden in Kyoto. That really hasn't changed at all, you know, except for maybe a building being built behind it, but the garden itself is the same. All they really do is add some new gravel. They just put a new roof on a new copper roof on the wall. But those are very static, whereas so many of these other gardens are not. So we don't really know what we're looking at. What did Rikyu's tea garden look like? It was probably dirt and stepping stones and a hut and some trees, and that's it. And now it's like the whole, you know, the moss has just become like this, taken on a life of its own, which is great. But I think it mostly happened by accident and not by design.
Like this picture, because of the mountain behind, it becomes beautiful like this.
Yep.
Without mountain, it won't be this attractive.
That's right.
I'm noticing in Kyoto, especially.
Yeah, you
because of
can't
the garden.
you can't see the shake anymore because of so many buildings and trees growing. So, you know, many of our friends in Japan that are gardening, that's the challenge. Like this, it's in the middle of nowhere. This area is very remote in Japan. It still looks like this today, but a lot of them. This one grew too big. When he built the garden, there's a shrine right here. The shrine was built for Ieyasu, actually, for Tokugawa, but the trees grew too big. So, yeah, it's a challenge. Yeah, Shugakuen is a good example too. It's totally different when you look out there. But you're right. It makes a huge difference without, you know, having this element to the borrowed scenery and the technique of, you know, eclipsing the middle ground. So that's why this was so revolutionary, because they began to integrate it. It was already being used, but it wasn't used in the tea garden sense. And then once it was, you know, the tea garden was probably the first garden building that was like deeply connected into the garden, except for a few, sort of feudal residents, like a military leader's house like this. So, yeah, it's turned it into an exciting, beautiful lake.
Maybe one more question?
Yeah. Yes.
I had a question. I couldn't help thinking as you were talking that these gardens and throughout their history and their evolution, it seemed that they were for the rich and wealthy.
Yep.
And obviously the people that worked on it weren't rich and wealthy because it required so much maintenance and forethought and afterthought and pruning and whatever. And so I'm just wondering if there's been a shift in culture, whether it's in Japan or throughout the world, where now all people can enjoy
That's
such
right.
manicured
So
gardens.
there were that's a great question, because I mean, there were no public gardens until after World War II. We had public gardens before Japan had public gardens. So yeah, there was a divided. These people that built these gardens weren't even mentioned. They were of a class of, because while it's a pretty much secular society, these people were the ones that were, handling animals. As a Buddhist, it was like impure for your soul to work in the dirt. And so, yeah, lots of issues. So these guys were called the river people. There's really great stories about materials being moved all over Japan, and like when they needed to move a rock through a town, they would just grab the townspeople. If they needed boards to run the ox cart on, they would just take them off of people's houses and move through the town and then put them back on, because they didn't really have a choice. That's the underbelly, the dark underbelly of Japanese
Oh, yeah.
gardens.
But other gardens too, the European gardens were that way
True.
as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, especially in the beginning. Palace gardens, only the nobles. Then, the temple gardens were very modest in the beginning. Medieval gardens is, they're starting to get some money. But you're
So
right, a
military.
limited class. I will say, the one thing about the tea garden, tea was the great unifier of Japan. It was something that everybody of any socioeconomic class could appreciate. So you didn't need to be rich to enjoy the bowl of tea or make a bowl of tea. And there's great writings about the poorest sort of beggar on the street that had a really great kama, a kettle for heating the water, that like some guy wanted and would be like, I'll give you, 1,000 lifetimes of money, and the guy would be like, no, it's not worth it to me. So that's probably not true, but it was sort of the sentiment, because that was the thing that everybody could wrap their sort of minds around, which I think a lot of cultures never had. All right, thanks for coming out.